Welcome back, everyone. In today's video, we're going to explore a more streamlined and efficient way of handling configuration properties in Spring Boot with configuration properties. This approach is perfect when you have complex or nested properties in your application.properties or application.yml files. It keeps your code clean and organized, making property binding much easier to manage. In our last video, we worked with @value to inject single properties into our Spring Boot application. But what if you need to work with a whole set of related properties at once? Injecting multiple properties individually can get messy. And that's where @configuration properties comes to the rescue. @configuration properties lets us group multiple properties together in a class, making it so much easier to handle complex configurations. This approach not only keeps our code clean but also scales perfectly as your application grows. So, if you're tired of manually injecting each property with @value, stick with me because today, we're going to dive into how to use configuration properties to simplify property management and keep things organized. Let's make our Spring Boot configuration even more powerful and efficient. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for this one. Let's get started. Let's create a class named userconfig. First, we annotate this class with @configuration properties. Here, we need to pass a prefix. The prefix will act as the identifier for the properties we're mapping from the configuration file.
So, here's the cool part.
When we define a prefix in @configuration properties, it essentially acts as a key or category for all the variables in this class. Every variable we define will automatically map to a property in our application.properties or application.yml file, and the property name will follow the pattern prefix.variable name. Now I'll add the prefix user to our @configuration properties annotation. This means that all the properties we define in this class will be tied to the prefix user in the application.properties or application.yml file. So, by adding the @configuration properties annotation, we've told Spring that if it finds any properties with a prefix user in our application.properties or application.yml, it should automatically inject those into the corresponding variables in this class. But here's the catch: @configuration properties alone doesn't create a bean for us. It simply marks the class as a holder for configuration properties. To make Spring recognize this class and inject the properties, we need to declare it as a Spring bean.
How do we do that?
We need to add the @configuration annotation to this class. This annotation tells Spring that this is a configuration class, and as a result, a Spring managed bean will be created for it. Add the @data annotation from Lombok. This will automatically generate the getter and setter methods for all the fields in our class. Now we're adding the username property to our userconfig class. The property name for this variable is either user.username in camel case or user.username in hyphenated format, depending on your preference. However, if you prefer the hyphenated format, you can use user.username as the property name in your configuration file. Now, the cool thing is, Spring Boot automatically handles the conversion for you. If you use camel case for your Java field, like username, Spring Boot will know that the equivalent property name in the configuration file should match either user.username or user.username. It even handles the conversion from hyphenated formats to camel case for you when binding properties. Let's add one more property, age. The property name for this variable is user.age. Now, let's add one more property called active of Boolean type. The property name for active variable is user.active. Now, we need to add all the properties in the application.yml file under the user prefix since our userconfig class is expecting properties starting with user. Alright guys. So, as you can see on my screen, I am adding the properties under the user prefix in the application.yml. Make sure you're following along, just like how I've added. Alright, now that we've set up the configuration properties, let's move on to the next step. Create a user class. That will hold the user details we just configured in the userconfig class. This class will contain the same fields as userconfig. Added data to generate getters, setters, etc. Add at noArgs constructor and at allArgs constructor to generate the default and all arguments constructors. Add at builder to allow us to use a builder pattern for creating user objects. Next, let's create another class named Configuration Properties Demo Controller. Use at REST controller to indicate that this class will handle HTTP requests. Now, let's inject the user config properties into the Configuration Properties Demo Controller. By doing this, we can access the properties defined in the userconfig class and return them in our REST API response. Now, let's define a get API that will return the user object. This API will fetch the values from the user config and return it in the response. Now, let's start the application. Now that the application is up and running, let's switch to Postman and hit the API we created. Now, let's hit the API. As you can see on my screen, we are getting the user details response as expected. We've injected all the properties from the userconfig class into our API, and the response is showing up exactly as we defined it. All those properties, like username, age and active, are now part of our application, thanks to the power of configuration properties. This method is super useful when you have many related properties and want to keep your code clean and manageable. No more repetitive @value annotations, just one simple configuration class to rule them all. Previously, we added username in camel case format in the YAML file. Now, let's change it to username, hyphenated format, and see how it works. Restart the application. And hit the API again. As you can see on my screen, we got the proper response even with the hyphenated property name. This shows that Spring Boot can handle both camel case and hyphenated property names, making it really flexible. Great! Now that everything is working fine, we've successfully injected configuration properties using configuration properties. That's a wrap for today. In this video, we covered how to use configuration properties to inject custom properties, handle both camel case and hyphenated property names, and bind them seamlessly to class fields. But wait, there's more. In the next video, we'll show you how to inject lists using configuration properties. It's going to be super exciting. If you found this helpful, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. See you in the next video.